Hello everybody, it is Train King James here, and we are here with the Season 8 tier list. Sorry there hasn't been a lot of videos recently. I've been away, so I wasn't able to edit anything, but we come back with the Season 8 tier list, so without further ado, let's begin. Obviously, we're now in a completely different era of Thomas. Now we're looking at a completely different style of storytelling and a lot of other things. And we'll start off with the first episode of this new era, no pun intended. Thomas and the Tuba, which I'm going to put in the C tier. This episode kind of has some problems to it. It's a perfectly fine story. I don't even think Thomas is terribly out of character. It kind of reminds me of a little bit of Thomas and the Guard. Him leaving, the guard behind and whatnot, but a more extreme version of it. This episode, though, you can feel that the writers are not used to writing a 7-minute episode, which it, for the most part, gets better over the season, writing stories that actually fit the 7-minute mark. This one is not. This could have been resolved in 5 minutes or less. This just feels like a very stretched out story, where the first minute and a half, Thomas makes his mistake. He's like, oh no, I gotta fix it. I gotta find the tuba player. And he goes everywhere, and it drags on and on and on. But the thing that it kind of pushes the episode up, I do like the variety of characters we get in this episode. We see, obviously, Thomas. We get Gordon and James at the beginning. We get Percy. We get Harvey. We get Birdie and Trevor and Elizabeth. The one thing about this season doesn't have a lot of characters in it, but they do kind of feature them all pretty nicely. So it's what bumps this probably and saves this from being a D tier episode, but it was just very drawn out, long, did not feel like they really put, they really did not know how to write a 7-minute episode yet. Percy's new whistle is a little bit better. And I'm going to put that in the B tier. And really the reason is that this story feels a little more full. It kind of feels like a classic series story with an epilogue. Because, you have Percy who goes around doing the thing he's not supposed to do. And he finally gets caught in an accident. And when he gets caught in the accident, that's normally where the episode would end. And Percy would learn his lesson. But we see kind of this epilogue where Percy applies what he learned to a real situation and uses his whistle correctly. It was nice to see Ari and Bird again. And, pretty solid episode. Then we get Thomas to the rescue. And I did not think I would have this episode as high as I'm about to put it, but I am going to put it in the A tier. This episode is a pretty strong episode. It's actually kind of a dark episode where Thomas is concerned about being scrapped. And there's a very vivid image of engines being scrapped in this episode, but it's also kind of nice. Obviously, it plays on the diesel and steam dynamic, and it's very interesting. This is the first time in the entire series that Thomas and Diesel truly interact. I know someone's going to comment and say, like, oh, well, they were both in the world's strongest engine. Well, they don't really talk to each other in that episode. They just happen to be they're like in the area, and Thomas is watching Diesel, but it's not like either has any impact on what the other is doing. This episode, they're talking to each other and interacting off of each other. And that's kind of interesting. You have, like, the series' main good character interacting with, the baddie of the show. I know that's going to get clipped somewhere now, but whatever. That's kind of the interesting dynamic we see them have. And this is a dynamic that would continue throughout the hit era and really the rest of the show. So, yeah, I do like this story. Again, it's much better. It fills out its runtime nicely. It doesn't have a lot of drag. It doesn't feel like it just doesn't have bad pacing, which you can find it in some episodes, but this one's a better paced one. And we have our first D tier episode of the season, and this could even be borderline F. Henry and the Wishing Tree. This is just not Henry. This episode, I'm not sure who came up with this idea. This just doesn't feel like him. The only aspect of it that I see, oh yeah, I get where they're going or coming from, is, his aspect of him liking the forest. Henry never really was a superstitious character, and this is not the only episode in this era that does that. I don't know why he becomes superstitious all of a sudden. It's just, it feels kind of childish, and there's another episode later on this season that does feel childish, but that uses a completely different character, and the way the other characters interact around the childish thing, it kind of makes it a more entertaining episode and a much better episode. But as it stands, this is not a good Henry story, and kind of one of the beginnings of Henry's character downfall. Then we kind of turn it around a little bit. We go to James gets a new coat, and I'm going to put this in the B tier. I think this episode does have some issues with its pacing, especially in the first half of the episode, because a lot of it is just James trying to show off his paint to people, and that kind of drags for a little bit. But eventually the episode kind of picks up once he interacts with Percy, which it's a nice James and Percy story, and they interact pretty nicely off of each other throughout this series. It's kind of the first James story of the era. It's a pretty solid one. And, yeah, I mean, I like the sequence when, obviously, the trucks cover him in coal and all that stuff, and I like how all the engines catch him. It's pretty much just the thing in this era. If engines are pushing a train, it probably doesn't end well, for the most part, because it seems like 9 times out of 10, if they're pushing a train, it usually is involved in some sort of accident or some sort of mishap. And it's usually done so the characters can get dirty or something. But, yeah, solid episode. Followed up by another solid episode that probably is... this episode's hard to rank, but I am going to put it in B tier. Thomas Saves the Day, which... It's weird they reused the title, although this title was at least only the US episode title that they used, not the, UK one, which they do later on this season. So I can give it a half pass, but it's a solid story. It's a little weird that Thomas has trouble, or is so nervous about something, going around a bend. It's a little out of character for him. I think there's better characters that this could have suited, but I do like that this episode does kind of highlight a little bit of Thomas's relationship with Annie and Clarabelle, how close they are, and how much he does rely on them to help keep him in line. But I love the chase sequence, the runaway sequence, when the trucks go loose and Thomas has to chase them down, and they biff and bash the buffers. That crash is amazing. The crash with Thomas and the coaches is cool, because it's not every day we watch engines pulling coaches derail. But yeah, pretty fun episode. I'm just not sure if Thomas was the best fit for the lead here, but it does teach a nice lesson. Percy's big mistake is kind of... It's okay. It's an okay episode. I like the crash with Gordon, and I do kind of like the idea of Percy thinking he's going to be scrapped. I do like that aspect of the story. But, especially the execution, Percy just loses a train of pipes and he doesn't even stop. And that was a weird scene. There's a lot of scenes in this episode that don't really make sense congruently. I don't think this is a well thought out story. I don't think it really flows together nicely. It's just kind of like Percy's overworked, then he's afraid of being scrapped, so then he's going to work even harder so he doesn't get scrapped. He spills a pipe load, doesn't even stop, then he crashes a train into Gordon, and then he runs away, and then everyone looks for him, and then eventually Thomas finds him and he's okay. But this episode could have been written better, and if it's written better, it probably goes to the A tier, but for right now, it's going to go into C tier. Before I reveal where this episode ranks, I have wrestled with this episode for so long, and there was a point in time that if I had done this maybe a couple years ago, this episode would be an F tier. But in recent years, I've really come around to like this episode. I'm actually going to put it in S tier, and I think this might shock people, and I'll explain. I really like Thomas and Emily's dynamic throughout this episode. Even to the point that Thomas is buried in snow, he needs help, Emily comes, and they're still arguing with each other. All this, and usually in an episode at this point, this is where they apologize to each other, and it's okay, and they hug and make up type thing. No, they're still mad at each other. Their rivalry is a whole level of petty that, I can't even begin to describe. So that is a really fun moment. I love that scene. I love the facial expressions between both characters as they like hurl insults and fire back between each other. It's really, really a good watch. It's a good watch, and I think it's a really nice story. The idea that, like, you know, both two wrongs don't make a right. Emily's wrong for trying to boss Thomas around, and Thomas is wrong for ignoring Emily's advice. I think it teaches a pretty strong moral. Kind of a complicated one to teach, but I think it uses the right characters. And I think this is a natural progression for Emily's character. I know a lot of people argue about that, but in Season 7, we saw her several times step into situations and kind of tell people, hey, you're in the wrong. And I can see after a while a character like Thomas being frustrated with that. Especially because he was someone in that situation a couple times in Season 7. Where I think even Emily may even realize, like, oh, Thomas is just this cheeky little engine. I gotta boss him around, tell him what to do so he stays out of trouble. But, you know, great episode, great dialogue, really an enjoyable one of the season. I'm surprised more people don't talk about this one more positively. But, yeah, Thomas Emily in the Snowplow. Great episode. Then we have Don't Tell Thomas. And I'm going to put it in the C tier, and I'll explain why I don't like this episode that much. It's a very heartwarming story. I love the idea of the characters wanting to do things for Thomas and make him feel appreciated because they know he doesn't like plowing snow. That part I love. But God, the whole, don't tell Thomas the surprise, they say in front of Thomas throughout the entire episode. And it's so annoying. Like, I can't help but, like, get mad with Thomas. And it's like, when Thomas leaves, it's like nobody cares. Like, that should be, like, everyone should be upset that they, like, hurt Thomas's feelings. It's not until they can't find them for their surprise that they're like, oh, please find them, Harold. Like, I don't know. It just doesn't sit right with me. The way the other engines treat Thomas. Like, Emily's really rude to him despite planning, you know, their surprise. I mean, obviously Thomas and Emily aren't best friends, but still. Like, I don't know. It's just everyone in this episode just is like, oh, don't tell Thomas. Like, right in front of Thomas. Like, if you're not supposed to say anything, don't say anything. Yeah. So, it goes in the C tier. Emily's new route has some iconic moments, and I think I'll put it in A tier. It's a really strong Emily story. I do like the idea that, like, you know, it's funny, as a kid, when you see the scene where, like, James describes Blacklock, it's like, ooh, maybe Blacklock is scary. And then when you're older, you're like, oh, the reason why James finds it scary is, like, oh, because there's boulders that will, like, bash your buffers and scratch your paint. He's worried about getting his paint ruined. It's a very subtle thing that's never, like, explicitly said in the episode, but it kind of actually makes sense why James would hate the Blacklock run. I love the scenes with Emily at the flour mill with the trucks. I love the crash. You know, I think this is a pretty fun episode, all in all. Really enjoyable one. Now we get to what I think is the best episode of the season. And it's Thomas in the fireworks display. And this episode is so good because I think it gets both characters right. Throughout Season 8, you've kind of had two sides of Thomas. You've had the side of Thomas that's the straight man, the all-knowing, he always knows what to do, you know, the good boy, that Thomas. And then you've had the other half, which is the, you know, the wrongdoer, selfish, you know, always causing trouble, can't do his jobs correctly, Thomas. This episode feels like Thomas, correctly written. He's really none of those things in this episode. He's not really the straight man in this episode. He's not necessarily even, like, the character who's supposed to mess up. He's just kind of, like, fussy. He's annoyed at James for bragging. So there's a bit of a rivalry there. And then when it's time to help James, he's ready to help. That feels very in character. And I like, even when he helps James initially, he has to like, make a jab. He has to just make a joke. To the point where it annoys James, or, like, James doesn't even want to help him. He doesn't want to help Thomas help him. And you know, Thomas has to point out, like, look, if we don't work together, like, the display is going to be canceled. And then James is like, okay, for the kids. It's really good character growth between both characters. It's really good work of their dynamic off of each other. Whoever wrote this episode truly understands both James and Thomas's character. They're both really well written in this episode, so I think that's why it's an S tier. And this episode used to be one of my favorites as a kid, and it still is. And I'll put it at the top of A tier, is Gordon Takes Charge. I like the pairing of Gordon and Percy, and it happens quite a few times this season, and this episode is pretty strong. I love Gordon's crash in this episode. I will say the thing that kind of knocks it down from S tier to A tier, it does get a little annoying hearing Gordon belittle Percy throughout the episode. It gets a little repetitive, but it's fine. It feels mostly in character. It is a little weird that Percy is so inexperienced with passengers, but I could believe this is a story that happened around the time of Season 1. I could believe that. So, yeah. All in all, solid episode. Really nice job. Really enjoyable. Spick and Span is a fine episode, but it's going to go in B tier. Really nothing all that special. I do like the moment at the coal yard where everything goes awry for the big engines, and Gordon ends up spraying coal all over, Sir Topham Hatt and the inspectors and whatnot. But for the most part, it's just kind of a boring, repetitive episode. I think that moment is the reason why it's not in C tier. I could put it in C tier. It's close, but I'll put it in B tier. It's okay. It's fine. It's just... You know what? C tier. I think it's just an okay episode. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's necessarily, good in any way. It's just okay. It's perfectly fine. Edward the Great is, I would say, an iconic episode, and a lot of people know, obviously, the story. It's obviously Tortoise and the Hare. I will put this in A tier. It's a really nice way to bring back Spencer, show him off more, have him interact with other characters. I have a theory that they wrote this episode after the Pack series was canceled and was told it probably won't see the light of day. And I figured, hey, maybe the plan was, they'll just do the Tortoise and the Hare story in this episode. So at least they could save it and just use it a different way, and I think they used it in a really nice way here. So, solid A tier episode for Edward and Spencer. And then we have Squeak, Rattle, and Roll, which goes in the A tier as well. This episode is a really good Gordon story. Not just a good episode for Gordon in Season 8. This is a really good Gordon story. Gordon's faced with the worry of him being scrapped. And he literally has to make a choice. And he makes the choice that, if this is his last run, he's going to go out on a high note and he's going to make it one of his best. It's a little weird that, Gordon is so worried about scrapped, but I can't help but love that moment when he just has that, come to Jesus moment of, look, this might be my last run. I'm going out on a high and I'm not going to lose. So, that it's a really, really strong episode. And I can't help but not, rank it this high. I'm going to put Thomas and the Circus in C tier. It's okay. It's kind of boring. We kind of know what the lesson is. It is a little weird seeing James wanting to be so helpful in an episode. He's usually... I'm surprised James isn't, jealous that Thomas is taking the train. He's not really jealous. He just wants to help, which just feels out of character. This feels like an episode where they're okay, we have to feature our, big three characters, because, at the time of, these seasons coming out, there was a lot of promotional material of Thomas and James and Percy together, so they felt like we have to do the same thing here. So, yeah, I get it, but I don't know. It just is a very bland episode. I do like the concerts that Thomas pulls. I like all the beautifully colored circus cars, but again, it's just kind of not that great of a story, and it's that generic Thomas has to do a job and he doesn't do it well, and he keeps being given opportunities to fix it, and he just keeps messing it up, and look. I am going to put this next one, in D tier. Because this episode is so boring. Oh my goodness, this episode just goes on and on and on about how monotonous Thomas's job is. And I get it, it's supposed to be boring. But, my God, it's just Thomas moving slowly against a gray background with a single truck, sad because he's not doing more jobs than everyone else. And it's just like, come on, people. This is such a overused storytelling thing, and it's boring. Like, add something. Even the scene where Thomas speeds up, it gets a little exciting for a bit. It's not even that exciting for long. So, it's just kind of a boring episode that teaches the same basic moral of this era, and that's why it goes in D tier. It just isn't enjoyable. I'll actually put it above Henry and the Wishing Tree, but it is so boring. This was one of my least favorites to watch as a kid, and it still kind of is. But we turn it around a little bit as we get As Good as Gordon, which I will put in the B tier. It's a solid story about Emily pulling the express. It doesn't go well, obviously, but, you know, it's her learning patience, and I think it's kind of a natural thing for her to learn at this point. Like, she's been such a know-it-all character who wants to prove herself, make herself one of the gang, and it's kind of an episode that reminds me, like, slow down a little bit. Like, you're pushing too hard. You know, you're pushing too much to be part of this, you know. Slow down, it'll come to you naturally. There's kind of a natural plot progression with her character if you go from Season 7 to Season 8 to what'll inevitably come down the line in the next season and whatnot. Or next special. But yeah. Solid episode for her. Solidly placed in B tier. And I think also going in B tier, Fish. I think it's a fine story. It's a little gross, not gonna lie, that the fish are traveling in open trucks, but, you know, it's weird that they also shares a title with a Season 4 story, but I guess they just didn't think about it, but who cares. I do like the use of the trucks in this episode. I love the crash. But, like, once the crash happens, not really much else happens. It's just Thomas doing his job correctly, so it's not entertaining. I might actually move it down a little bit, but it's a fine episode. It's not bad. It's a little bit... It's good. It's a good episode. It could be better. 1 second. There we go. And then we get Emily's Adventure. And I gotta be honest, I think I gotta put this in the C tier. I mean, I thought this would be an episode I would put in D tier. This does feel like a backstep for her character a little bit, and it feels like this could be an episode that I should rank lower. But I do kind of like her dynamic with Elizabeth in this episode. You have two older women who are very stuck in their ways, that are just basically two immovable objects that refuse to, like, you know, move their ground. They want to stand their ground. And then Thomas comes in, who hates Elizabeth, but also kind of hates Emily, let's be honest, and just immediately sides with Elizabeth. It's kind of like the enemy of the enemy thing, which is like, that moment kind of saves this episode, but Emily's just so mean in this episode, like, overbearingly mean. It's just, I don't know what it is. She's just super impatient, super rude. And this episode is like, you gotta say please and thank you. And I get it, it's trying to teach a moral, but it's just so in your face about it. It's just, I don't know. It's C tier, but it could be much lower if it didn't have that scene with Thomas, Emily, and Elizabeth. But do not fret, as we now will move to a good episode that goes into S tier, Halloween. Again, it's another good Thomas and Emily episode. This one, they're both being cocky, and then they get scared. Bert gets scared. Everyone loves this episode in the fandom. I think it's one of the few of Season 8 that everyone unanimously agrees is really good. But I would probably put this episode... I would probably rank the episode this high. I think it's a solid, you know, strong episode this season. Really good use of the characters. Everyone's in character. I do kind of like that, like, Thomas and Emily are starting to get closer as friends at this point. Again, natural progression of character. It's interesting. Then we get You Can't Do It, Toby, which I'm going to put in the D tier. I don't like this episode. It's weird to see Toby, after the last few seasons, be so down on himself and just be so easily deterred and so self-conscious. That's just really never been his character. And here he's just so down on himself. Gordon's picking on him, which doesn't help, but he's just so down on himself that it just kind of feels weird. It just feels weird the way he treats himself throughout this episode. So I'm just not a huge fan of it. Next we have James Goes Too Far. And I'm going to place this episode, and then I'll kind of explain why I placed it where I did. I'm putting it in the C tier. There's a lot of things I like about this episode, but the episode story doesn't work for me. I think James is characterized nicely. I think this episode kind of reminds me a lot of Troublesome Trucks from Season 1, which is one of my favorites. It's kind of that same episode where James is kind of down on himself, and he has to pull a good string to kind of prove a point or something. But I think this is kind of going to turn into a tangent, so you might want to sit down, grab a bowl of popcorn and listen. When it comes to teaching morals, you have to be very careful on how you explain the moral to an episode. You can't just use a moral that's very black and white, but use it in a very gray manner. Morality is often very gray. It's very hard to just pick something and have it be something that is applicable to every situation, right? This episode kind of has that problem. The moral of the episode is that, no job's more important than helping another engine. But it's not handled correctly. So there's a scene in the episode, for those of you who don't know, where James is stopped by Edward, where Edward needs help taking trucks to the quarry. But James has to take coal trucks to light the station fires and whatnot. He has to deliver coal to warm all the stations up. I kind of feel like that takes precedent over taking trucks to the quarry. I mean, I feel bad Edward is overworked. Also, he's weirdly feeble in this episode. I don't know why. I guess they kind of wanted Edward to be like the oh, you gotta help the old man cross the street type thing. Like, I get it, but it just kind of comes off as preachy in this episode, because I totally understand why James wouldn't help Edward. Because he can't. He has a job to do. And the episode constantly paints James in the wrong for that, and I don't think that's right. I think if James had the time to help Edward, and he was getting his paint, or he was getting repainted, then I would understand that side of it. But that's not what it's weird, because he's told he has an important job, which is to deliver coal to all the stations, which is going to warm up passengers, and without said coal, you have passengers waiting in cold station rooms until trains come during winter, which is not a good thing. But that's I feel like that's kind of a job you have to get done. So it's this weird situation for James where he's kind of put in this almost in this no-mas situation where it's if he helps Edward, he's wrong because he's late. He did a good deed, but he's still late, and passengers will complain about that sort of thing. But if he doesn't help Edward, he's wrong because he's prioritizing his own self over others. And it's well, in that situation, I kind of understand. It's this weird thing where the moral is trying to be you always have to help people before yourself. But if you always help other people, you can never help yourself. And that means you're prioritizing other things in other situations that aren't your things. And sometimes the thing you are doing is more important. So I kind of side with James on that part. There's a lot of other parts of the episode where I'm yeah, James is in the wrong. But it's not even him helping others. It's just him being impatient. Him not taking on water is him being impatient. That's not him helping anybody. So the lesson shouldn't be that helping other engines is more important than your own job. Is that you should do your job properly. You should always make sure you shouldn't rush your work, is the thing. So it's weird that this moral is trying to be taught in an episode that doesn't really explain it well. I know that's kind of a tangent, and I hope that made sense. But anyway, that's why I put the episode in C tier, because it's got a weird story and a weird moral that doesn't make sense. And Chickens to School is going in F tier, because this episode makes no sense to me. So Thomas is tired from working hard. Fine. Thomas has to pick up sheep from the farm, chickens, and children. He has to take the chickens to market, he has to pick up chickens from the farm, sheep from the valley, and children from the station. He has to take chickens to market, sheep to the farm, and children to school. Thomas goes to all of those places. For some reason, when he goes to the market first, they randomly unload the sheep because Thomas tells them to. Because he's tired. That's not Thomas's job. He takes the goods to where it is. It's one of those episodes where it tries to make the characters have more autonomy when they don't. This episode doesn't make sense. Thomas being tired is not why the sheep got delivered to market. It would be different if Thomas had taken the sheep somewhere that isn't anywhere near the market because he was tired. And the other things, other places too. But he just he goes to all the places. For some reason, despite not needing to take the chickens, the people at the school unload chickens. Like, someone would question that before then. That was very weird. So, I don't really blame Thomas for that. So that's why I kind of rank this episode low. It's just bad and the story doesn't make sense. And, the one redeeming factor is I love the scene at the sheds when Thomas kind of reveals, Gordon's teasing of him and says, Gordon says an important engine never needs help. And Edward just laughs. Like, it's the first time, really in the show that Edward just straight up laughs at something like that. Because of how ridiculous it is. And it shuts Gordon up immediately. But other than that, I think it's a bad episode that doesn't make sense. Too Hot for Thomas is just a generic episode of this era that Thomas has a job he doesn't want to do and everyone's got more exciting jobs than him. It's the same thing as Thomas Gets Right. It's a little more entertaining, but it's still not that good. So I'm putting it in C tier. Really don't have to explain it much further. Now, earlier I mentioned, Henry and the Wishing Tree was kind of a silly episode, but it doesn't really fit Henry. This episode is a silly episode that fits Percy. And I'm going to put it in B tier. I really enjoyed this episode, actually. It is a little too silly, but I kind of like the idea, is the carpet alive or is it just the wind? Obviously it's the wind, but, I do kind of like how wacky it gets. I like how everyone else reacts to the wackiness, Gordon and James are so dismissive of it. I do kind of like seeing Murdoch again, although he doesn't speak. I just like how crazy the episode gets, but, I do like, even at the end, even Gordon's on Percy's side about it. But yeah, that is Season 8, so a very different tier list than what you're seeing. Multiple selections in the D and F tier. C tier is the largest ranked tier of this season, but there's still plenty of episodes that are enjoyable. It'll be very interesting to see what the tier lists look like as we go further down. Anyways, this has been Train King James signing off with another tier list. See you guys later.